over 240 people register in advance for the program today. So I see that there's still people in the waiting room. Again, if you're joining us, please type your name and organization in the chat box. We appreciate you being patient as we double check security, and I'll just get started. My name is Erica Sanger, and I hope everyone is well and staying safe and taking good care. I want to remind everyone that even though we might be having fun on these Zoom conversations, and that we are learning this new technology, and that's all really exciting, that there's a reason why we're doing this virtually and we're not all in the same room. So please do what you can to stay well and stay safe. And again, we're almost halfway to letting people in. So I want to say thank you very much to Stephanie Cunningham at Museum U for helping us put these programs together. It's been a real pleasure to work with Stephanie and to look at the ways that the two organizations can come together to support the field. Today's program is supported by the New York State Council on the Arts, I Love New York, Dutch Culture USA, and Humanities New York. And I know I saw Nicholas pop in on the screen. Thanks for joining us, Nicholas. Wait a couple more people entering the waiting room. Great. So today we are absolutely honored to welcome Jennifer Scott and Cordell Reaves and Stephanie Johnson Cunningham, co-founder and executive director of Museum U, for discussion about essential work in public spaces and how our understandings as museums and cultural professionals are shifting in regards to those public spaces. Next Monday, a few days from now, is actually the last of the programs that we're going to do in 2020. We're going to take a break for a few weeks. We'll start again January 22nd, Friday, January 22nd at noon. We're going to go back to doing some virtual meetups. So watch for that invitation. But on Monday, we'll have a virtual tour of the New York State Capitol building. If you've never had the pleasure of working in those spaces or taking a tour of those spaces, please join us. It's absolutely one of the most gorgeous public spaces in our state, and I would argue in perhaps the nation. So before I turn it over to Stephanie, I just want to thank our members and supporters who's helped us over the year. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining us. We've learned that we need everyone's voices to make it through this crisis together. And we are hearing you loud and clear about the changes that this field needs to make to move forward together. So I'm gonna turn it over to Stephanie, and it just jumped one, which should not have happened, but take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's really good to see some familiar and new faces and names here today, and I look forward to the dialogue with both Jennifer and Cordell. Just to share a bit about Museum U, Museum U works to paint a larger portrait of the arts and culture field by providing greater support and opportunities for people of color throughout museums and other cultural institutions across the US. Founded in 2015, Museum U has partnered and collaborated with arts and cultural entities throughout the nation. In addition to our in-person workshops and guided experiences pre-COVID, we also wrote a lot about issues in the field that address race equity. Next slide. Museum Hue currently has over 150 institutional members that also work to support our initiative in allowing more agency and opportunities for people of color throughout the museum field, and also utilizing Museum Hue to cast a wider net to find more people within the field who can be a part of the institution. So we're sort of also become like a new staff recruitment strategy to reach more diverse candidate pool. In addition, I like to also show our universal flag. So Museum Hue, we work to, discuss racial equity in the field and to move the discussion further, even beyond the museum field. We created the universal flag, and that flag is just a visual representation of our work. We like to say that we look to movements like Pride and also the Pan-African movement that both have flags to represent their work. Next slide. Museum Hue also recently created an interactive, accessible, user-friendly directory and digital map of culturally responsive institutions created and led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the United States. The database provides access to the rich cultural landscape found across the nation. It helps to increase their visibility and broaden public knowledge of art, history, and culture. There are currently hundreds of these kinds of museums across the country, but their work and innovations are often overlooked and underrepresented in the mainstream museum discourse. So this platform works to usher in greater exploration and research of these sites. So please utilize this directory. I think it's a really great insight into just the vastness of institutions throughout the country, but specifically institutions that are Black and Brown led. Next slide. And with that, I would like to now welcome our speakers for today, Jennifer Scott and Cordell Reaves. So Jennifer Scott is an anthropologist, curator, and public historian whose work explores connections between museums, arts, place, and social justice. She recently served as director and chief curator of Jane Addams Hull House Museum, a historic landmark in Chicago that focuses on civil rights and human rights issues. At Hull House, she led the exhibition's community engagement efforts and overall vision of the museum for nearly 6 years. In 2019, the museum was recognized with the Award for Excellence in Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice by the Association of Midwest Museums. Previously, Jennifer served as Vice Director and Director of Research at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, a nationally significant historic site that memorializes a free Black independent community in 19th century New York. Jennifer is currently the Vice President for the Association of Midwest Museums and a board member for the National Association for Museum Exhibition. A civic leader in Chicago, she was appointed in 2020 by Mayor Lori Lightfoot as co-chair of Chicago's new Monuments and Memorials Advisory Committee. She also serves on the City of Chicago's Cultural Advisory Council and served as co-chair for the city's Museum Task Force, created to help museums reopen under the pandemic. For over 18 years, Jennifer has served as faculty at the New School in New York, where she teaches courses in arts and civic engagement, cultural anthropology, race and ethnic studies, and museums and global studies. Jennifer researches, writes, and lectures locally and internationally on arts and social change, memory and place, contested histories, and innovation strategies for museums, history sites, arts, and cultural centers. I'll also like to welcome Cordell Reaves. So Cordell serves as Historic Preservation Program Analyst with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, developing educational programming and events that enable sites to tell complete and inclusive stories. He has a MA degree from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Museum Studies and a background in African American history with over 20 years of experience working with historic sites and museums. His research interests cover a broad swath of New York State history, from early Dutch settlement in New York, colonial slavery, the Underground Railroad, anti-slavery movement, and the Great Migration. He has also spoken extensively on the relationship between tourism and historic sites and has worked with tourism professionals to share New York State history with a broader audience. Cordell currently sits on the advisory board for the Historic House Trust of New York City and the Albany Cultural Heritage Advisory Team. In 2017, Cordell was the recipient of the Outstanding Commitment to Diversity and Inclusion Award from the State University of New York. Cordell was also recently awarded the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Service in New York History from the New York Academy of History and the Hudson Distinguished Service Award from the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Born and raised in Brooklyn, Cordell now resides in Troy, New York. Help me in welcoming our speakers, Jennifer Scott and Cordell Reaves. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just thumbs up if you can hear it. Great. Okay. So I know Erica's putting up my slides. While she's doing that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and a special thanks to Stephanie Cunningham, the Museum Hugh, and Erica Sanger and Manny for inviting me to speak, but also you all and your teams make such an enormous contribution to the field. So just thank you for all that you do. For those of you who know a little bit about me, you know that I lived and worked in New York for a very long time. And so it's really nice to return, even virtually, and be reunited with my New York Museum massive. I see a lot of familiar institutions and names and faces. And of course, I have to give a shout out to my Weeksville peeps who I see on the line. So thank you for joining. And of course, Cordell Reaves, who I've known forever. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you again and reunited, who's his own kind of force. So thank you all for joining. I know that we're all coming from different places, and I am now based in present day Chicago, as Stephanie mentioned. So I wanted to first send greetings from and acknowledge that where I am, at least, we're situated on the original homelands of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Thank you. The focus of my work, as Stephanie talked about a little bit, is on marginalized histories and contested heritage at museums and historic sites. And so today, in particular, I'm going to talk about monuments in general, what's at stake with the controversy, and some of the work we've been doing in Chicago recently, and what might be possible, just to kind of get the conversation started. So if I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of people think that all of this controversy around monuments just happened recently, but the truth is that people have been fighting for many, many decades against offensive and racist monuments, trying to change street names, you know, the parks names, and the fight in the public square has been going on for a long time. However, I think at least in the last 5 years, this fight has been reinvigorated with the recent political uprising effort. And unfortunately with tragic events. So I wanted to take us back to that reinvigoration or moment, or, you know, there's many moments where it's happening, because I think it kind of tells us what the fight is about and what's at stake. So if you remember, in 2015, there was the horrible Charleston church massacre at Emmanuel AME Church. And immediately following the massacre, in an act of civil disobedience, Bree Newsom, who you see here, famously pulled down the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House. And that wasn't accidental. It's because it was associated strongly with the mass murderer of the Charleston massacre. And shortly after that, you started to see this reverberation across the country, a demand to remove Confederate symbols that accelerated even across the globe. When she was asked why she did it, because there was a lot at risk, which I won't go into, but some are obvious. This is her reply. I realized that now is the time for true courage. The morning after the Charleston massacre shook me to the core of my being. I couldn't sleep. I sat awake in the dead of the night. All the ghosts of the past seemed to be rising. Not long ago, I had watched the beginning of Selma, the reenactment of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and had shuddered at the horrors of history. But this was neither a scene from a movie, nor was it the past. A white man had just entered a Black church and massacred people as they prayed. He had assassinated a civil rights leader. This was not a page in a textbook I was reading, nor an inscription on a monument I was visiting. And I wanted to start there reading her words because I think it's really important to remember that people are connecting this call for removals and reassessments of monuments directly with real horrors and harms that are happening on the ground. Those are very closely linked, and I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the fight for public space and what this is all about and what it means to people, and that can help us to better inform how we should move forward. Next slide, please. I also wanted to bring up Take 'Em Down NOLA, which is one of the earliest grassroots organized efforts that was in direct response to Charleston in June 2015. And I want to remind us that how important the role of activism, in particular Black activism, has been in this controversy, in this fight for public space. And again, it's not accidental. These are directly linked to the dehumanization of Black communities, this fight for the symbol. People say it's just a symbolic realm. And it's because of that activism that any changes and any reassessments are happening at all, I would say. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, who is behind a lot of the call for this. And of course, there were 4 monuments that were called by the mayor to come down as a result. But I think that's at the center in thinking about what's at the ground level. Next slide, please. Because this is a museum crowd, I also want to point out these are Take 'Em Down NOLA, and I didn't mention Take 'Em Down NOLA is actually an offshoot of Black Lives Matter and BYP 100 that are organized specifically around these takedowns. So what I think is interesting, and I'd like us to think about more, is how we pay attention to the way that people call this vandalism. I call it recontextualizing, reinterpreting in the museum world these monuments. But the way that people are doing it, we don't have to imagine what they want to talk about. I mean, people are telling us what they want to talk about with each other, what they want to talk about with us. And I think it's important for us to pay attention and think about, this maybe even as a clue to what kind of memorials we can think about in the future. Next slide. This is another example of Take 'Em Down NOLA, and I just love this. Gave us Bibles, stole land. For those of us who write labels in the exhibition museum world, it just doesn't get much better than that in terms of a label. Very powerful reinterpretations, and I think that these can lead to where we need to go. Next slide, please. So obviously, this call for reassessing monuments and the takedown is not just happening in the South, it's happening in northern cities like Chicago and New York. I'm not going to talk as much about New York because I know Cordell is going to, but this is the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History that was just removed this summer, and which I never thought would happen. And there's many, many more. Next slide, please. And it's not just a local and national conversation, it's also a global conversation. This is the successful Roads Must Fall campaign that resulted in the removal of Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist, and there was a lot of civil disobedience when this happened, before this happened in 2015, that led to this. And it was also a call against institutional racism. So again, I just want to keep reminding us how people are connecting these to real important horrors that are happening in the world and harming people. Next slide, please. Okay, so enter Chicago. Probably I shouldn't have called this Chicago responses because it's not exactly responses. Oh, did we go back a slide? There we go. It's not exactly Chicago responses as much as I just want to give you some samples of contested heritage that are happening in Chicago that have been happening for a long time before I ever arrived in Chicago. Next slide, please. So the first example is Ida B. Wells, who is who should be a well-known anti-lynching activist and journalist and suffragist. And one of her descendants, Michelle Duster, who you see here, is the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. And she's been fighting for many, many years with other advocates to try to get a memorial or some sort of tribute to Ida B. Wells, which had not happened in Chicago, and because they could not raise the money that needed to happen. Next slide, please. Until last year, the Congress Parkway, a major boulevard here in Chicago, was renamed for Ida B. Wells Barnett. And probably through all this energy and momentum, they were finally able to raise enough money and are now working with well-known artist Richard Hunt to create a memorial. So it'd be really exciting to see what comes out of that. Next slide, please. Another example is Jean-Baptiste Coin de Sable, who is attributed with being the first non-native settler of Chicago. He is of Haitian descent, and other than this bust you see here and a museum that was named after him, a lot of people don't know about the history. It's been silent and invisible. So many, many groups are advocating to create monuments that will do justice to his legacy and correct this erasure. At the same time, we all know that he and others who came to settle Chicago didn't come to an uninhabited place. So this history is very complex, and there's questions about how we tell these shared stories of all these complexities and conversations with one another. Next slide, please. And in fact, I don't know any other way to say it, Chicago has so many horrible depictions of Native Americans and indigenous communities like we do in many states. I wanted to share this example because this is Fort Dearborn Massacre based on a battle that happened during the War of 1812. And it's a terrible depiction of a chief that's raising his hand to rescue a white woman from another aggressive indigenous person. But I wanted to share this example because it's no longer on exhibit. And that's because there were protests in the 70s when it was situated in what's now the Chicago History Museum to take it down. So again, to show that these arguments and these calls for representation have been going on for a long time, and it's still in storage somewhere. Next slide, please. So I was surprised about this when I came to Chicago. Chicago also has its own kind of Confederate monument. But this is actually not in public space. This is a private cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, and it's not your typical Confederate monument that's aggrandizing the Confederacy. This is called the Confederate Mound Monument, and it's a 30-foot granite monument with a bronze statue of a Confederate soldier that commemorates those who were killed in this terrible prisoner of war camp. So it has over 4,000 remains here. So it's not a typical Confederate monument. However, how is it utilized? Every year, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans host their annual ceremony here to pay tribute to the Confederacy. Next slide, please. And there's always counter-protesters every year in the cemetery. Next slide, please. In the same cemetery, it just so happens that the tombstone of Ida B. Wells Barnett is there. So a lot of the counter-protesters use this to show, her grave is not anywhere near the grandeur that people feel it should be, or that the Confederate mound is. And so I wanted to give this example because it shows, again, a conversation that's happening, not necessarily a public space, but by the public with each other in the same space. And I just feel like there's opportunity there all the time when you see these kind of discussions happening. Next slide. This just happened recently, maybe even like last week. I'm losing track of time. But after a few years, again, of student-led activism, the Chicago Park District just announced that Douglas Park on the west side of Chicago, which was previously named for Stephen Douglas, who was, among many other things, a pro-slavery senator, it will be renamed for Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass, who are well-known Black abolitionists, which I think is a really interesting example where the name is kept. People were calling for the name to be the same, but just to acknowledge the correct spelling and to change who the Douglas belonged to, which is also kind of subversive and kind of creative as well. Next slide. The most publicized controversy that happened this summer was that not one, not two, but 3 Christopher Columbus statues in different neighborhoods were taken down by the city of Chicago. And that's because there were so many protests around these monuments that resulted in many, many people getting seriously injured. And so the mayor and the city took them down, they said temporarily, to because of a public safety issue. Next slide, please. And so in response, the city just formed a new memorial this summer, a new Memorials and Monuments initiative to assess the city's memorials and monuments and public arts collections, and of course to make recommendations. And I am honored and terrified to be the co-chair with my other 2 co-chairs, Commissioner Mark Kelly, who now heads the Department of Cultural Affairs for the city, and Bonnie McDonald, who is the Landmarks Illinois president and CEO. The committee that is forming to assess these monuments represents a very diverse perspectives and experiences. It includes artists, cultural and civic leaders, elected officials, historians, preservationists, activists, etc. It also is this unprecedented collaboration between 3 city agencies you see here, the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, the Parks District, and the public schools, who all have public works that are problematic. Next slide. Oh, you could just keep clicking, and there's like 4 points there. I took that out. Thank you. So our charge, of course, is to form this commission, and then also to catalog and assess, inventory, and flag problematic monuments in these collections of the three agencies. And this is kind of where we are now still. This is unprecedented. The public school districts, for example, just got the approval to move forward to do their first inventory, which is really exciting. So this is taking some time. And then, of course, once we flag these problematic monuments, we will be bringing them to the public in conversation to learn as much as we can about what people care about, what people don't care about, what they mean to them. There will be educational programming. And then also the idea is not to make recommendations for every single monument, but to create a blueprint that shows how to address the problematic issues in the collection in general, for sure, and moving forward, and how to inspire new work. So we will be working with artists to create new commissions, which is very exciting. Next slide, please. Oh, you can also do the clicking thing again. Sorry, it is about 4 or 5 points, I forgot. Thank you. So what's in the collection? This is what we're finding that's getting flagged. A lot of it has to do with the early founding history of Chicago, conflict and cross-cultural contact. There's lots of problematic depictions of explorers and war heroes and settlers. Either they're distorted or they don't tell the whole story. And what it's causing us to do is to rethink these larger ideas of progress, victory. How do we make someone a hero? Why is it so individualized? Can there be collective heroes? How do we think about permanence? Should monuments be ephemeral, temporary? Should they be small instead of large bronze structures? Like, how do we think about what does legacies justice? Next slide, please. Oh, these are just some questions that we're asking. There's many more. I'm sure all of you on the call are asking these same questions, how we think about these shared histories. They're not just shared, they're also antagonistic. But who's missing is a big part of it. So that's why we're not just focusing on the existing collection. And then really trying to think about moving forward in the future is a big part of it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to include this section. So we're not quite there at what's possible in the new work yet, but we do have reference points that are out there that are sort of interesting to look at, that especially are connected with public art. So I wanted to throw out a few of those Chicago, New York examples, other examples that help with our discussion. Next slide, please. So of course, everyone on this call, I'm sure, knows the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, led by Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative, which is this unprecedented monument and museum that is a tribute to the more than 4,000 racial terror lynchings in the US during a certain time period. And, you know, in many ways, if you look at the memorial, you know, it's got these 800 steel blocks and the scale is enormous. And there's some very conventional ways that it's being memorialized. But what's unconventional is what is being memorialized, I would say. And that it's this history that no one really wanted to pay tribute to. Next slide, please. This is the Legacy Museum that's also connected to the memorial. And again, museums are conventional mediums of themselves in terms of delivering this history. But what's unconventional about this is that it's documenting or paying tribute to this history of state-sanctioned violence from slavery to mass incarceration, which is not what people usually address in monuments and memorials necessarily. Next question. Oh, I wanted to use this example. This is an international example because a lot of times we're finding there's hardly any women. You see a lot of white men on horses, but there's hardly any women in the landscape, in these representations. So this is something called I Am Queen Mary in Denmark. Artists Lavon Bell from St. Croix and Jeanette Ehlers from Copenhagen, they were commissioned and collaborated to create this memorial that's a tribute to Mary Thomas, who was this 19th century freedom fighter who led a major uprising on St. Croix when it was under Danish West Indies, when it was the Danish West Indies. And then eventually they were arrested, all the conspirators, and they were imprisoned in Denmark. And so they were commissioned just 2 years ago to create I Am Queen Mary. Well, that was their design. And this is the first time that there is a Black woman that there's a public monument to in that country, 2018. So again, bronze, you know, very conventional way of memorializing, but the subject matter is completely different. It's subversive, and even the, you know, the title I Am Queen Mary and playing with royalty and aristocracy. Next slide, please. Okay, of course I have to give a Brooklyn example since Brooklyn is near and dear to my heart. Stephanie. So Shirley, and also we have a Chicago artist who's a part of this design, Amanda Williams, who we adore. So Shirley Chisholm, everyone knows, is the first woman to ever seek the Democratic Party's nomination for the president of the US, and the first Black woman elected to serve in Congress from Brooklyn. In 2019, as I'm sure a lot of you know, it was noted that there were only 5 historical statues to women in New York City compared to the 150 statues of men. And that is now being addressed through this initiative that includes a tribute to Shirley Chisholm, which is called, it's going to be, I don't know where they are on it now, but it's called Our Destiny, Our Democracy. And it might have traditional mediums, it might have traditional mediums of portraiture, but you know, you see the materiality is very different. And also, you can't see from this design, but the artist designed it so that it's not just about Shirley Chisholm, but it's also the people she brought, blazed the trail for and brought through. So it's interesting because it's closer to a collective monument or thinking about that. Okay, next slide. Sorry about this slide in advance. I'm not on Twitter. So after Charlottesville, if you remember in 2017 with the Unite the Right rally and it was a lot of white nationalists who were protesting or counter-protesting around the Robert E. Lee statue, and they killed the protester. It was terrible. After that, the current president tweeted out, can't change history, but you learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. Which I think is a sentiment in general that a lot of people have, that you can't, if you keep removing this, you're taking away all of our heroes and et cetera, et cetera. And so next slide. What I like about this intervention, they answer his question in their title of their project called Washington's Next. So this is in New York. This is a collective, I think, of artists and public historians, including Lyra Montero, who's a colleague, who's brilliant, who are doing these site-specific, participatory, and commemorative experiences that question the founding fathers and challenge ideas around leadership. So they're saying, you know, Washington, he's a leader of liberty, but he also enslaved thousands of people, and asking how do we question those legacies and represent them. So you can see here in this intervention, it's around the statue of Washington. On a certain occasion, I think they had how many people he had enslaved, which was 271. So they laid out these 271 blank chalkboards. So playing with the idea of erasure and public memory. Next slide, please. This is a close-up. And then they let people just sort of dwell with that a little while. And then they had these plaques they created, 271, I believe, of the biographies they knew of people who were enslaved. And they let people engage with those stories and select one per chalkboard to then write their name on to make them visible. So it's really interesting possibilities in terms of thinking about public memory and erasure and how to engage one another. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. Next slide. So I wanted to close with a Chicago example, especially because I think if you don't know about this project, it's important to know about it. This is the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial. This is part of an unprecedented reparations legislation that was passed by the city of Chicago my first year that I came to Chicago in 2015 for torture survivors of police brutality. It's a really important case, totally unprecedented. If you don't know about it, please learn about it. What's very interesting on top of everything else is that the final component of the legislation was to create a public memorial for the torture survivors. So next slide. So the designers who were selected here are Patricia Wen and architectural designer John Lee, and they created something called Breath, Form, and Freedom, which is to bring further awareness to the struggle and justice for over 125 Black and Latinx men, women, and youth who were systematically tortured for many decades under former Chicago Police Commander John Burge and the men under his command at the Chicago Police Headquarters. So they will be, this is not built yet, but they work, I think it's important because they worked with a community process to create this. Next slide, please. And as you can see there, again, there's some very conventional mediums in terms of semi-permanent or permanent structures and names of victims, but the subject matter is very unconventional. And the artists even call it an anti-monument monument, which I think is kind of interesting. Next slide, please. I wanted to just throw out this quote, an excerpted quote from the American Historical Association, because a lot of people, again, are saying, oh, you take the monuments, you erase history. And I think it definitely goes deeper in that and down to the question of, I'll just read the last part, which to remove such monuments is neither to change history nor erase it. What changes with such removals is what American communities decide is worthy of civic honor. And I think that's the opportunity for us to think about how we move forward, given that. Who do we honor and how? Next slide. This conversation is much bigger than all this, and I know it's like a lot of material. I am eager to connect with anyone doing this work. So this is, if you want to reach out to me, please feel free in the future, because I'd love to continue. I know we got a lot of questions in advance. It was so great to read. And I'm going to end there. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that, and looking forward to hearing what folks think, and definitely want to hear from Cordell as well. So Cordell, if you can join in on the conversation, looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer, and sorry, thank you, Stephanie. And Jennifer, that was amazing and wonderful, as I knew it would be. Learned a lot, food for thought. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you to Museum Hugh and Manny for allowing me to participate. I think that what I'm going to be talking about today is really kind of a description of the struggles and the questions that I have been asking myself regarding the idea of how we remember and what we choose to remember and how we memorialize. Whether it be monuments, whether it be temporary memorials, how we go about that process, who drives that process is a question that I have. So I'm going to focus mostly on two projects that have taken place both within the New York State Office of Parks. One at the Highland side of the walkway over to Hudson, and another at John Brown Farm in the North Country of New York State. So I will share my screen and we can get started. So just a bit about me and what I do. New York State Office of Parks oversees 35 state historic sites, covering a range of topics. And part of my job is to provide interpretive support to these sites in the form of assisting with tours, assisting with exhibit development, signage, and sometimes even professional development opportunities. This is a mural that was on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. I was in Brooklyn at the time that George Floyd was murdered, and the world was able to see in very stark reality this entire incident on video, and played on the news over and over and over again. It was kind of burned into our collective memory. And since I was in Brooklyn, I began to observe. I was blocks away from the Barclays Center, which, if any of you followed the news during that time, where major protests were breaking out. And I was able to observe a lot of just these spontaneous responses in the landscape to what was happening. So there was the protests, but there was also the visual protest. There were murals like this going up on the street in response to this. And I began to think about all the responses that have happened in the past with victims of police brutality and violence, and just the temporary nature of those things, but how they're community driven. So a group of people locally in that community, or even one individual locally, decides that I need to express my grief, my outrage, my pain. I need to convey that visually to the people around me. And some of it is catharsis, I believe. Some of it is a visual form of protest, and some of it is memorial. But is typically almost always not set in stone, but temporary. And I think that these temporary visions, these temporary expressions, can have sometimes as much of a community impact as something that's intended to be a long-term installation or even a permanent installation in the landscape. Because as opposed to some of the permanent installations that are set in stone that become part of the landscape, they continue to have meaning to those who have created it and everyone they've created it for. This is an example of a street memorial in East Flatbush, created in response to the murder of Kamani Gray. And this is from 2013. And I just wanted to go back in time to show that, growing up in Brooklyn, this was an unfortunately familiar sight to me, where these street memorials would be set up almost spontaneously at the point where someone was murdered or a specific event happened, and people would just gather and they would put down candles, teddy bears, handwritten signs. These memorials are a community in mourning. These memorials have a weight and a meaning to them in the landscape, even though they're not permanent. They have a weight and meaning to them for that community and for their creators that is in some ways just as important as what we set in stone, just as important as issues of public art. They're a way for people to voice their point of view, their issues, their opinions about what has happened and their emotions around what has happened. So it's a a self-curated experience. There are no museum professionals. There's no, larger framework. It is just people coming together to express themselves. And I think in some ways, these types of memorials, even though they, have no real framework to them, there are no rules with it. I think we should start looking. Oh, sorry. Am I muted? I kept getting messages that I was muted. Sorry about that. We should start looking at them and giving them weight and documenting them as museum professionals, documenting these places, documenting these incidents, documenting these public community reactions the same way we would other forms of public art and memorials and monuments. So, walkway over the Hudson Bridge stretches between Highland and Poughkeepsie, New York. It's one of the largest, tallest rather, pedestrian walkways in the world. Walkway over the Hudson is a state historic park. And on the Highland side of Walkway over the Hudson, there was a project initiated to honor Sojourner Truth. One of the things that I have had, and one of the issues I've had in the past with monuments in the landscape, is that sometimes over time, they lose their original intent and meaning to people. And this piece of public art that was created by Vinnie Bagwell as a sculpture, which you'll see in a moment, has an entire interpretive framework around it, which I think is extremely important. So there was a film created, actually 2 short films created to educate people about Sojourner Truth's impact, her importance, and also interview with the artist and creator, Vinnie Bagwell, of the sculpture. And there's also signage put on site, a series of interpretive signs that provide a key to all the different symbols and meanings. There are all sorts of things, references to past events, anti-slavery, women's rights, Frederick Douglass and other major figures. There's a Sankofa symbol, one of the Adinkra symbols embedded into the sculpture. So the entire sculpture tells a story. The artist was trying to convey, Sojourner Truth as a warrior, as someone who is an abolitionist, as a preacher, trying to tell her entire story graphically through this sculpture. But if you had set this sculpture out without any interpretive framework around it, no one would have understood all those layers. So I think that sometimes that's the piece that's missing. These things go into the landscape, and the community did not generate, this sculpture. An artist generated, and it's a beautiful vision, which I think really helps keep the legacy of Sojourner Truth alive. But if we're going to add meaning, if we're going to make this relevant and meaningful to someone, they need to understand the layers and they need context. So the film and the signage provide some context for someone coming to this who has maybe heard the name, but doesn't understand the impact, doesn't understand what she did, who she was, her impact on anti-slavery, her impact on women's rights, all of the things that she did that make her special and worthy of receiving this honor needed to be included somehow. So this idea of having some type of memorial that's permanent, but actually does educate the public also, you need interpretation. You need that bridge between the facts and actually making those facts meaningful to people. And on the other end of the scale, and here's a picture of the monument itself, of the sculpture, and that is a picture of Vinnie Bagwell, the artist, on your left, and the gentleman standing next to her is actually a descendant of the Sojourner Truth family who came to the event and the opening which was held this past August with extreme social distancing, except for the two of them standing together. Another example can be found up in the North Country, John Brown Farm State Historic Site. And this is a sculpture of John Brown with a young African-American boy. And many people have questioned this sculpture at the site of a human rights activist. The posing of it, the look and feel of it comes across to many as being paternalistic. And it's something that we've talked about, internally, that I know visitors have commented on. And it's interesting because John Brown is probably one of the more human rights focused sites we have within our collection. His entire life and the cause of his death being related to the struggle for human rights. But this sculpture in some ways is problematic, even though it recognizes a figure who's definitely worthy of remembrance. But this past year, in response to everything that's been happening, and if you look at the lower right-hand quadrant of your screen, in the center of that circle is where the John Brown Monument is. And on the green space around that monument, you see these little white dots. Each one of those is signs. The Friends group for the John Brown Farm State Historic Site, called John Brown Lives, was approached by an artist. And this artist wanted to, after the death of George Floyd, which was such a catalyst for so many people, wanted to do something, wanted to come onto the grounds and to place some signs that could be gathered together to honor those who had died as a result of state-sanctioned violence. And this became the memorial field for Black lives at the John Brown Farm State Historic Site. And this was not a state-driven project. This was a local artist who lived one town over from the town, who knew someone from the Friends group. And she decided that she wanted to find a way to honor these individuals. Her name is Karen D. Stewart. And this is a long view of the field. And the Friends group, John Brown Lives, decided to station people out in the field at various points to have dialogue with visitors who were walking through and had a reaction to what they were seeing. For some people, that reaction was very powerful, very emotional. For some people, they wanted some information on why this was here. So it was an opportunity to explain and connect the current activism going on to the history of activism that is represented by John Brown's crusade, not just to end slavery, but to make sure that human rights are at the forefront in America. This wasn't, because there are plenty of abolitionists who wanted to end slavery but did not believe in social equality, did not believe that people of African descent were people that were their equals in any way. They wanted to end the institution, but they did not accept the common humanity of people who were enslaved. They would never have invited someone who was enslaved to sit at their table, or to come into their home, or to go visit their home even and sit with them as a friend. It was a political issue that required a political solution for them. John Brown transcended that in believing that Black lives did indeed matter. And being able to bring that full circle here on the grounds, again, a community-driven an individual driven effort by one community member being moved to do something is something that's worthy of recognition and is worthy of us capturing that. You know, this is something that will go, we hope, some of these signs, which have now been removed for the winter because of the harshness of the weather up in the Adirondacks. But we are hoping that some of these signs will eventually make their way into our collection and that we'll be able to interpret them. We've documented this process on film, and all of this has been driven by the wonderful people at the John Brown Lives Friends Group who have been out on the forefront long before the events of this past year, and tying John Brown's history and using John Brown's history to talk about global human trafficking issues today, mass incarceration issues today. And I guess that's my core message, that memorials and any type of public recognition of events, of tragedies, they sometimes have more weight when they're community driven, even if they're temporary, and they're always worthy of being captured. They're always being worthy of being put into context by museum professionals who can use their skills at interpretation to help make that relatable for someone who didn't experience that themselves. So for the person who's coming into this memorial field for Black Lives, who is falling to their knees and is having a desperately difficult time having to read each of those 50 names, that's someone who is having that experience already. They understand why it's there. They understand why it's important. But for someone who walks through and says, what the hell is this? Why is this here? How do we reach that person? How do we make that memorial matter as much to one as it does to the other? How do we bridge that gap? Whether that memorial is permanent and set into the landscape, or whether that memorial is temporary and community driven, how do we bridge that gap? And I think for me, it has to be using interpretation. There has to be context put to that memorial. There has to be some type of message sent beyond what appears, to make it relevant and to make it meaningful for people. So on that note, I'm just going to end with this final sign from the memorial, which is what sparked and started me questioning so much and thinking so much about these issues. And it's still something that I think about frequently, because I was the same age as George Floyd. And when I drive around Brooklyn or any other city, I think that could have been me. That could have been my life ending at that moment. And I think it's important whenever we see memorials in the landscape that we remember that we are trying to express a sense of not just outrage and protest, but creating empathy. What do you feel when you see these things? And do you understand what others feel when they see them? And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Cordell. Again, and thank you as well, Jennifer. I know I can say I learned so much from both of your presentations, and I'm sure many people would agree. But I think for me, what I appreciate most about both of your presentations is that you both highlighted that we need to begin to expand the way we see and think of monuments. Jennifer, you gave the example of collective memorial versus an individual memorial. And Cordell, you mentioned, pop-up memorials and other memorials that focus on tragedies also being preserved and interpreted and community driven, put into context by museum professionals. And so I guess the question that I have for you both is, why do you think that is so essential for us to begin to first rethink about the way that we look at memorials, and also why it's important for them to be interpreted instead of just blending into the landscape?
Well, I think there's so many reasons. I mean, for one, I think it's important to show that history is participatory. So someone doesn't get to decide, you know, who we honor. It should be a more engaged process about what people care about and can participate in that process along the way. So I feel like there's more agency. The process itself is probably the most exciting. I mean, I love the art and the art interventions. I can't lie, but I like the process part, rethinking that and what it does to us in terms of thinking about how we, you know, rethink these narratives in general. I think that's super important.
Yeah, I would agree with Jennifer. It's like I think that, you know, again, we need to bridge that gap. You know, it's if this response in the public is a response based on not being heard in other ways, then it's not just about hearing, but also understanding what you're missing, right? And the interpretation can sometimes be the way you can understand what's being missed. If this is in your blind spot and suddenly appears in the landscape, how long before it just blends into the background, unless you understand what it means, unless you understand what the actual intent is, what people are trying to convey. And you can put your own assumptions aside for a moment and try to get to the real intention of that.
Absolutely. One of the questions that came in from a participant said, given the seemingly insurmountable issues that exist in our country today, why is it economically sound to shift fiscal resources to the removal of monuments and create new ones that project positive images of the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color? Or is there an alternative solution to the problems of long-standing tradition of historic interpretation and representation of people and events that resulted in Black erasure?
Well, you know, I mean, and Jennifer, I see you smiling. Did you want to jump in there for a second
It's such a
shall
good
I?
question. You go ahead.
It
I have a
is.
lot to say about it.
I mean, I bet you do, because you're dealing with these issues in real time right now on the commission. But, and I'll just speak, you know, for myself with this, that I think that, you know, every community has to decide, you know, how it wants to, you know, honor or remember. You know, but I think that this is not purely a matter of funding and resources. You know, they are resources for all sorts of things in a community that are not necessarily for the direct benefit or need of that community, but happen anyway. But yes, there are plenty of alternatives. There's, you know, spontaneous public art interventions that happen, like the, you know, Black Lives Matter mural that I showed in my first slide, you know, on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. That obviously was not generated by any type of official body or commission. There are different ways to remember, and some of them can be practical and short-term and continuous. Some of them can be audio, even audio and media based. But I don't think that it is for others to decide. It's like, well, that community should not remember that incident in any permanent or lasting way. I think for years, you know, we have watched monuments grow up to people who we are told, you know, are worthy of our respect and are American heroes. And then to find out that, well, these American heroes engaged in exploitive and heinous acts, you know, do we still want to honor them? Do we still need to have them in the public space? Is this an insult to people and the descendants of people who have suffered for years as a result of those acts? So do we want to reconcile with this history or not? Do we want to call this open display, many cases of white supremacy in a public landscape, which we all share, what it is, or do we want to continue to deny it? And sometimes that may involve public funding, that may involve removing something, that may be necessary. But how we go forward and what we choose to do to make sure that people who should be remembered, who have done amazingly selfless work for decades, like Ida B. Wells, James Baldwin, others, how we go forward with that and how we honor them, I think is something that's up for debate. I don't know if it needs to be what it's been in the past. I don't know if we need to reproduce what hasn't worked on so many different levels just because it was done before.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that you're saying. I think, I really appreciate the question for the many questions within it. So I really appreciate the pragmatic part of the question. Like, is this where we should be spending our money? There's also a question about sustainability. Like, is it worth the investment? But I must say, when I hear phrases like economically sound, I get a little bit nervous because everyone who's done budgets, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call who've done budgets, knows that it's not just about numbers, it's about priorities. And people get to decide the priorities, as Cordell was saying. So I am biased, obviously, for so many reasons, but I think that history is pragmatic. And I was sort of alluding to that in the presentation. Brian Stevenson, so many people have talked about this, and I think it's really important to say that these systems of inequity that are literally killing people, that are producing disparities in poverty, that are allowing, by not stopping it, allowing police violence to go unchecked. All those systems are driven by policies that are fueled by narratives. They have no lifeblood without those narratives. Those narratives that we're all working for and against, they justify those policies, they justify those systems, they feed those systems. And if we're not actively liberating those narratives, we are directly feeding people's, terrible fates. We're delivering them terrible fates. There's so much power in the narrative. I think it's completely economically sound to liberate the narrative. And also, if that's not the case, I've probably wasted most of my adult life because that's really all that I do. I think it's really important to make those connections between those narratives that are deeply embedded, that are created, that get sustained and fed through things like monuments and other things. And that keeps those systems of inequity alive. So I think it's a high priority. I think it's an opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity to make an intervention. I think, I don't know, I feel it urgently all the time. So I think we've got to work from all angles. Yes, directly work on all the social issues we need to, but also liberate the narrative, work on all the knowledges. I mean, obviously it's going to take a lot of us to do it and a lot of us to work in different areas to make it undone and to create something new. So I think it's quite economically sound. I think, the narrative is where it's at.
Yeah, and to that point, Jennifer, about creating narratives, there's another question that I also wanted to highlight that came in from a participant that says, as a Native American museum professional, curator, director, how can we be involved further as consultants on this topic? For instance, the American Indian Community House or curating indigeneity group offer advocacy for an authentic perspective. We have had conversations with city, state officials, but these individuals never really commit to hearing our call to action about Columbus Circle, for example, monuments, Indigenous Peoples Day, and representation in public art or within the arts community. We also encourage efforts to seek authentication from the mentioned organizations before allowing just any person claiming to be Indigenous before the consultation takes place. How can we make sure an accurate and proper dialogue takes place for our representation?
Wow. I don't have the answers to all that. But I don't know if that person who made that question is on the call or not, but I know you don't want to hear this. I don't even want to say it. But first of all, don't give up. This is like the long game. So a lot of what's happening now has taken years and years and years. So please don't give up, because we need you at the table. The Chicago Commission has multiple people who are connected to Native and Indigenous communities. And I think that's important, not to tokenize people. It hurts me that you're not being listened to. Keep trying. I think it's important to organize as much as possible. Obviously, we can't do this alone. But it's not easy work, because it's so embedded and it's so rigid. But we need to, I think there was a question about it, the beginning was about how do we get to be consultants? I think you need to be more than consultants. I think you need to be like decision makers as well. You know, the way that these decisions are made and the way that people are invited in, the fact that you're not listened to is a problem. So, you know, I'm sure you know that, stating the obvious, but, you know, finding kindred spirits and keep driving. It's going to take driving.
Well, and I would add to that, you know, if the, you know, municipal and government officials are not listening, which is, you know, appalling. If you've offered your services and you've offered to provide guidance to them and are being ignored, I would look at the local museum community who is interpreting this history, and I would offer, you know, your services to them also. If they have any intersection with Indigenous peoples, First Nation history and culture at their historic site or at their institution, whether it be something that, you know, through things they have in their collections or with the place of their institution, and I think many places do, I would offer those services to them. It helps to correct history that has been misunderstood or even outright ignored for many years, but it also helps to create allies within your own community. So when you are going to these municipal officials, when you're going to these elected officials about these issues, you are no longer going alone. You are going with an alliance of different institutions that you have helped to push and guide in this direction, which I think is a lot more powerful than standing by yourself.
Absolutely. And the final question I'll ask relates to activism. So do you see museum industry and historic preservation as a field moving toward activism as a focus?
I hope so.
And it depends on what you consider activism. I don't consider asking museums and historic sites to tell complete histories and to expand out of the standard hero narrative as activism. That's our job. We have an ethical responsibility to be historically accurate, right? So this is what we should have been doing all along. It's not, you know, I don't see this as a huge activist step. It's just accurate history. You want to talk about the, you know, the wealthy family, but not how they generated that wealth or who maintained the massive estate or, you know, how it was built, how it was run. It's something that we should have been doing all along. I don't think we should consider that activism. I think we can move into the realm of activism. And I think many museum organizations are, you know, again, you know, not to beat the drum, but, you know, John Brown Lives as a friends group for a state historic site has just been amazing and really pushing the envelope and forcing people to sit with their discomfort, which is part of the problem. People being unwilling to sit with any discomfort around issues of race and equity and inclusion, and to talk about these issues and the dialogue about these issues, relating them to history. So I think that there are individuals, there are organizations out there that, yes, are doing that work. Obviously, Museum Hugh is doing that work, and the dialogues and events that you create. There are a few other museums, some of them represented here, on this Zoom meeting, who are doing great work in that regard. But we have a lot more to do. I mean, we have so much more to do than what's been done. And it can't just be in response to what is happening. This is work that is ongoing. This is not work for this year or work for the next 10 years even. This is work that has to be built into your mission, and that has to permeate your board and your staff and all your volunteers and all levels of your organization. It can't be lip service.
Yes, I agree. And I think of activism not as an end goal, but as a tool in the process. And what's the goal? The goal is that, the situation is that these disciplines and industries, the museum field and preservation, have been incredibly elitist and exclusionary, and completely favored dominant narratives. It's still a huge problem, especially the museum world changing a lot. Preservation is changing a lot too, but preservation is in the business of keeping things the same. Activism is, getting some changes instituted. So there's a tension that's always going to be there for preservation. But I think of, again, a little shout out to my Weeksville people. I think of Joan Maynard, who was this artist who led the fight for Weeksville, and who became a lead preservationist in an area where Black people were not being allowed in preservation at all, and paved the way, for a whole new way to approach this in that field. So, and that's in the 60s, that's 1968. There's, as Cordell said, we have a lot of work to do. So as long as there's work to do, I think it's a very useful tool, whatever you want to call it. But I'm hoping that people are keeping their eyes on the prize and thinking about, what they're actually trying to address, so that you use those tools properly as well. If that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you both so much again for participating on this panel. Your brilliance is needed in this field. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, thank you to Erica from Museum Association of New York for partnering with Museum Hugh for this dialogue.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your passion and your energy and your personal experiences. We look forward to gathering again when it is safe for all of us to meet in person. So stay well, stay healthy, and we will see you all in 2021. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, Stephanie,
you.
Cordell.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.